Takže já bych se rád představil, mé jméno je Jiri Mzourek, jsem manažer ze Sun Microsystems tady v Praze a zároveň bych rád přivítal jménem Zdeňka Mudovce, řekněme hlavního organizátora ze strany ČVUT. Takže co bude obsahem mé malinké přednášky, krátké přednášky, teď na úvod 5-10 minutové. Chci vám říct něco krátce o World Usability Day, co to je. Krátce shrnout program a závěrem ještě poděkovat všem, kteří umožnili to, že se tato událost koná. Takže velmi krátce, co to je World Usability Day. World Usability Day se poprvé v historii, v celosvětové historii, koná dnes. Byl určen 3. listopad a řekněme hlavní událostí, která je, řekněme, tou, která drivuje celé tato událost, je konference DAX, Designing User Conference, která dnes taky začíná v San Francisku. Je to 3denní konference a je věnovaná samozřejmě usabilitě, ale řekněme na úplně jiné úrovni, než o čem se budeme bavit my tady. Je přímo specializovaná na jednotlivé věci velmi do hloubky. Je organizovaná ACM. K dnešnímu dni na World Usability Day se přihlásilo cirka 70 měst z zhruba 30 zemí. Největší počet je samozřejmě z USA. Pro zajímavost z našeho regionu je jeden v Polsku, jeden v Bulharsku a myslím 2 v Rusku, jeden v Moskvě, jeden v Petrohradu. Jinak zbytek je bohužel buď v západní Evropě, nebo v Americe, nebo částečně v Asii. Co je cílem? Primárním cílem je popularizovat usabilitu. Cíl je jednoduchý, víceméně jasný a řekl bych minimálně tady pro nás velmi důležitý. A to proč? Rád bych shrnul stav usability, řekněme, na našich tocích v České republice k dnešnímu dni. Takže, jak jsme na tom s univerzitními programy? Univerzitní programy momentálně začínají prvním rokem na ČVUT. Díky spolupráci mezi SUNem a ČVUT momentálně první rok, kdy máte možnost se na univerzitě naučit něco o usability, návrhu uživatelských rozhraní, usability testech a accessibility. Komerční sféra. Co myslím komerční sférou je, že existenci firem, které se zabývají děláním usability testů, user researchem, designem user interfaceu. Pokud to porovnáme i se stavem, co je v Německu, tak u nás není absolutně nic. Trh práce. Primární problém. Minimálně to byl problém můj, když jsem zakládal User Experience Team tady v Praze. Pokud přijdete za personální agenturu a řeknete, že chcete usability profesionál, vůbec nevědí, koho chcete. Zase situace v Americe, v západní Evropě je naprosto jiná. Totéž i ve firmách, komerčních firmách vůbec tyto pozice neexistují. Obecný pojem usability, accessibility zmiňuje se, díky bohu, ale většinou jenom v kontextu internetu, webových stránek. Zhruba asi před dvěma lety jsme zkoušeli formovat lokální SIPKAI, což je zájmová skupina zase pod ACM, která je zaměřena na tento obor, velmi dobře fungující, třeba v Bay Area, no vůbec v celé Americe. Momentálně, minimálně v té době, jsme nenašli nikoho, kdo by se do této skupiny zapojil, kromě pár lidí z ČVUT a myslím Pavel Slavík je teď předsedou pro Českou republiku, ale bohužel jsme stále velmi malí. A obecně, co vidím jako velký problém, že neexistence nebo vůbec nepovědomí o usabilitě je velký problém pro Českou republiku obecně. Ať už pro ty produkty, co tady vznikají, ať už je to software nebo hardware nebo cokoliv jiného. Ale hlavně i problém pro efektivitu práce kohokoliv, protože v dnešní době používá počítač doopravdy skoro každý. A pokud to používá značně neefektivně, tak produktivita práce jde silně dolů. Takže co nás dneska čeká? Krátce po mně bude keynote od Rhodese Klementa, direktora ze Sunu. Poté začne naše sekce Sun Microsystems, pak bude oběd v 1 hodinu tady v předsálí, máme na něj zhruba hodinu. Pak bude krátký vstup od Czech Investu a pak následuje sekce od ČVUT a poté se přesuneme na Karlovo náměstí, kde budou praktické demonstrace Usability Labů. A dále pak neformální recepce, víno a tak dále. Poděkování. Samozřejmě Usability Professionals Association, byl to jejich nápad, jejich organizace, takže chci poděkovat jim. Dále sponzorům. Sponzoři nám dokonce i poslali pár, řekněme, pomínkových předmětů nebo dárků. Takže pokud se zajímáte o usability study nebo vás to zaujme, tady v předsálí jsou CDčka od firmy Textmy, je to software Moray, takže tam je evaluační verze a nějaká demonstrační prezentace. Chtěli bychom poděkovat firmě Dobrý web za mediální prezentaci na Lupě na Rutu. Dále pak za záznamy AVC. A samozřejmě vám, účastníkům konference, takže kdybyste nepřišli, mělo by cenu tuto konferenci pořádat. A hlavně teď spoléháme my na vás, abyste šířili to, co se tady dozvíte a doufáme, že vás to zaujme dál. Takže pár jenom poznámek. Veškeré přednášky, co dnes uslyšíte, budou na webu. Takže pokud si budete nějaké poznámky, mějte na paměti, že si nemusíte psát všechno bude, myslím, v PDFkách na webu. Moray už jsem zmiňoval, máme tady ještě pro vás trička, je více jak 80 triček, každý si vezměte, to je jedno, aby to pro ostatní. Potom máme tady CDčka z Netvínci, plus ČVUT přineslo nějaké další upomínkové předměty nebo reklamní předměty a od dobrého webu tady jsou také a od Systemetu. Takže to je vše z mé strany, jenom možná jedna logistická poznámka. Samozřejmě oběd je zdarma, máte k němu i pití zdarma. Teď samozřejmě kdo měl kávu, čaj, všechno je zdarma. Mezitím, co si dáte na baru, já nevím, kdyby chtěl někdo pivo nebo něco takového, se teda platí. Jenom abych předešel nějakým případným nedorozuměním. Takže to je vše z mé strany. A já bych rád teď předal slovo Rhodesovi. So Rhodes.
Great. This is great to have so many people here for the first World Usability in Prague. How many people in the audience today are usability engineers or do design? Do we have any? A few. Okay, that's great to see. So I'm going to start today by looking at what is usability. I know that everybody has a picture in their mind about what usability is about, but I thought I would go to users to find out about usability. So I went to visit Wikipedia. I'm sure most of you know about Wikipedia. It's an online encyclopedia that's created entirely by users through a wiki. So what do users think usability is? And their idea is that it's a design of objects based on the psychology and physiology of the users. And the goal is to make things more efficient to use, easier to learn, and ultimately more satisfying to use. And I think these are really the key points. So it's good to talk to the users about what usability is about. You need to worry about the psychology of your user. So their anthropological issues, their background, the space that they work in, their knowledge base, as well as the physiology of your user. There are alternatives in terms of people's physical abilities, eyesight, hand-eye coordination. All of those things are important. And ultimately, we want to make products that are fun and easy to use and that people hopefully love. So why is usability important? So that we don't end up with things like this. So you could imagine stepping into this elevator with labels like these and buttons like those. What do you push? So we don't end up with signs like this. I'm sure if anyone had usability tested this, they would have found out that was probably not a very good sign for that trash can. And I don't know about you, but if I was planning on going to a nightclub, I probably would not want to be going to a fish house. So I think most of you in the audience today are really technologists, engineers. How many people here are in IT or engineering out of the audience? looks like most of you. So I'm going to focus a little bit on usability and technology. So I was actually in the plane on the way here today, or yesterday, I guess, and I opened USA Today, and they had a recent Gallup poll just taken on frustration for people with new technology. So if you look at this, let's see, 45, 58, 64%. 64% of people are frustrated, at least some of the time, many of them most of the time, or all of the time, whenever they get new technology. So all of you are working on probably new technology or new additions of technology. That's a high number. So the goal of usability is really to bring that number down. And to bring this home, since most of you are in computer engineering, when asked which technology frustrates people the most, it's actually computers. So people are also frustrated by their cell phones or digital cameras, DVDs, or music devices like the iPod. But the reality is the computer is the most frustrating technology out there. And as probably all of you know, there are many more cell phones and DVD players out there on the marketplace. And if we want the computer technology to really grow globally, we need to make sure that it's as usable and as accessible as possible. So let's bring this home to actual software engineering for big corporations, which many of you probably work on. Jacob Nielsen did a study which showed that 63% of large software projects are over budget, and the top 4 reasons out of the top 10 are related to either usability engineering or not anticipating user needs. So that's just during the initial phase where you're creating the software. What about after you ship the software to your users? 80% of software lifecycle costs, so this is from the beginning when you actually engineer the product, sell it, all the way through its end of its life, 80% of the costs are really associated with unmet or unforeseen user needs. So what this tells us is if 63% of cost overruns come out from not anticipating user needs, and 80% of costs after you ship the software come from unmet or unforeseen needs, if we would look at user needs before we engineer software, we ought to be able to save quite a bit of money. This is a recent study from Forrester Research. So I know Jacob Nielsen's been saying this for a long time, but as recently as October of this month, they went to 20 major European auto, media, retail, and telecom industry sites and found that none of them actually offers an acceptable user experience. So that's a problem. Bad design is bad for business. Ultimately, for people, when you have bad design, it takes people longer to get tasks done. So if you don't understand their task model, they'll use your software and take a long time to finish their work. That's time lost, which is a productivity loss. Ultimately, when you use software across a big group, so if you create software that a company has 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000 people using that software, you multiply even seconds or minutes per task across all of those people, that's a huge productivity loss. Also, certainly, you saw some of those signs. Ultimately, bad software, you can imagine in air traffic control, where people's lives are at stake, bad software can lead to public safety issues and ultimately personal risk. And the last point on here, which is an important one, unhappy customers talk. When we've studied, there are a lot of studies that show how people, when they have a bad experience, what they tell a friend. So the average person who has a bad experience with a product or a service will tell 10 people about that bad experience. The average person who has a great experience will tell 3 people. So we know that when you produce a bad product, you have a factor of 10 in terms of bad word of mouth, and you can only make up for that by a factor of 3 when you do a good job. So that should tell you that it's important to get things right the first time. Good experiences are good for business. Obviously, people are able to get their tasks done more quickly. It creates a great user experience, lots of productivity. Another thing that's really important, if people have one product that you've worked on or your company has worked on, and they understand how to use it, and you do a good job with user experience, hopefully you apply the same experience to the other products that you make. What that means is when people buy a second product from you, they have even less time to learn that product. You can imagine in typical on the PC, Control-C is copy, Control-V is paste. If you went to, you got a PC from another manufacturer and you hit Control-C and it deleted your document, how frustrated would you be? So it's important when you create these design concepts that you carry them across all the software you design. And ultimately, good design will lead to repeat purchases, happy customers who only tell 3 people, and hopefully people spending more money with you or the business that you work for, and less money with your competitors. So examples of companies that have done a great job with user-centered design. All of you, I'm sure, no one on the planet, I think, has not heard about the iPod. There are, in fact, 63,000 different music devices on the marketplace. How many people can name 5 other than the iPod? Anybody? Yeah, 5? I won't put you through it. But basically, Apple did such a great job in terms of a very intuitive user interface, which is fast and easy to use, as well as a great ergonomics that meant that they've dominated this market space in spite of the fact that they have 63,000 competitors. Google, people today, search is almost synonymous with Google, so that people say, I'm going to Google something. If you think about the Google interface design, Google is designed to do one thing, which is to search. And if you've ever noticed in the upper corner, it shows the amount of time your search took. So, 0.22 microseconds. They're reinforcing all the time through very simple design and simple design cues that they're about one thing, which is search, that they're fast and they're accurate. So other people who have done search, Yahoo, Microsoft, their search engines became more and more cluttered. It was difficult to tell, is this a browsing or a category engine? Is it search? Is it about news? Is it about current events? And because Google focused on what the user was actually coming to do, which is to search, they have a dominant place in the marketplace. Also, the Aeron chair, great example of great design for the task it's designed for. And what does this do for companies or for individuals when they build well-designed products that people understand? They get very loyal followers. Believe me, anyone who's got an iPod is telling a friend, buy an iPod. So, user-centered design. How is it that people are able to build these great products? User-centered design is really a process of understanding the users who are going to use your product and involving them in every step of the process, or at least you're thinking about them. From the strategy of your product all the way through the delivery, you need to think about the people who are going to use the product you're designing. And so to get to this more user-centered environment for a more usable world, there are 3 things that are very important. User research. You are not your user. Everyone, I think, is naturally a designer. We think that we understand the person who's going to use our product, but I guarantee you, you are not your user. User feedback. So even if you understand your user and you think that you've designed your product so that they'll be able to use it, you need to take it out and actually test it. And ultimately, the best way to do this is through what is called participatory design, which is bringing the users into the design process. So not just testing on them, but using them to help define solutions to design problems. So, getting to know your users. You may be an expert about the product that you build. You may even be an expert about people. A lot of usability engineers have degrees in either computer science, human factors, psychology, anthropology, and they feel like they really understand people. The reality is, every person is different. As I look out across this room, every one of you looks different, and I'm sure every one of you uses products differently. And the reality is, people are strange. If you actually observe how people work or how people live their lives, every one of them is unique. Another thing that's really important to realize, users lie. I know that sounds negative, and I don't mean it in a negative way, but if I was to ask this morning, Jurka, who walked over to me, or walked me over to the event this morning, I said, how long will it take to walk here? And you said, 15 minutes, and it took 30. Now, that's not because Jurka didn't mean to tell the truth. It's because all of us anticipate what we're going to do. We make estimates. We are often wrong. We don't mean to be wrong. So it's not enough to ask users questions, like put out a survey, or get them in the room and ask them questions. You need to observe them working. There have been a lot of studies recently that show because of email, telephone calls, basically the busy, hectic life that people have in an office, they rarely spend more than 2 to 5 minutes in a concentrated fashion on any task. So you may ask someone, when you're sitting down, let's say you build systems administration software to administer a server, and you go out and you ask some sysadmins, how long do you spend partitioning a drive? And they'll say, oh, I sit down and I spend an hour and a half. If you actually go out and watch them in the environment, they spend 2 minutes, they pick up a phone call, they send 3 emails, they run down the hall to reboot a server, they come back, they spend 30 seconds, they go away, they come back. So the user interface needs to do things like help people remember where they left off, understand the state. So it's very important to observe users, and not just observe them, but observe them in the environments where they really work. One of the things you can do when you understand users is build what we call personas. So these are archetypal users, where maybe you get a set of users that you think are going to use your product, and then you actually build the product by creating a persona and then creating a scenario, an imaginary situation in which someone's going to use this product. It's still, you have to go out and find out how people actually use your product. I'll give you a great example. We were building java.com at Sun Microsystems, which is focused on people who play games on cell phones. And we went to talk to the people at Yahoo because they have a great online Java game section, Yahoo Java Games, to find out how they built their Java Games site. Well, they built their site with a set of personas that were young people from the ages of 13 to 19, who were early technology adopters, fast-moving things, MTV generation, very flashy. They put out the site, and they had a huge drop-off rate. No one was actually using it. So they went online to do some testing to find out who was actually using the site. How old do you think the average user was for Yahoo Games? Anyone want to make a guess? 60? Not quite that old, but actually the average age, 44. And the average user, 44-year-old woman who was playing solitaire or other kinds of games while multitasking, taking care of the kids, doing laundry. So they actually had a completely different user than the user base that they thought they were going to have. So even if you think you know who your users are going to be, you go out and test them, you build a persona, you build a product, you still have to go out and find out if you were right. So that brings us to testing. Test early, test often. If you can get things in front of users, you can do simple things. 5 to 10 users. If you know your user type, bring them in off the street. Call a friend. Have them sit down and try it. And one thing that I can't stress enough, your users are always right. I make any engineer that works for me who's designing an interface, they have to go to a user testing situation where we put them behind a mirror, behind the glass, and they watch people use their product. And you can see them. The user's there, and they need to click on something, and they're looking around, and they click on the wrong thing. And the engineer is behind the glass saying, they're so wrong. It's right there. Why don't they just click it, right? And their first instinct is that the user is wrong or not educated. The reality is you cannot go to the home or office of everyone who's going to use a product that you design. So the users have to be right. And if they can't find the button, if they don't understand the next step, if they try to help and it doesn't help them, that's a problem with the design. So there are simple ways to do this. You can do paper-based prototyping. So you can actually sketch the design of something out on paper, take it to users, and ask them simple questions. If you click on this button, what do you think would happen? Let them describe their expectation. Or ask them, what is the first step you would take when presented with this screen? They're simple questions. It's easy to do. And believe me, drawing on a piece of paper is much cheaper, much faster, and much easier than writing the lines of code that would build the logic that sits behind that screen. And ultimately, the goal of this is to get it right, or as close to right, the first time. I can guarantee you, if you set this out as the user experience for selecting a fork, knife, or spoon, and you put a user in front of it and you said, pick a fork, you would immediately find out that this is not a very good user interface for choosing a fork. So this is all about bringing customers into the process. Participative design, which is the ultimate goal of user-centered design. A common thing that you can do with users is card sorting or organization. Let's say you have a complicated interface where people need to select between 30, 50, 100 500 different tasks, objects, or items, essentially an array. And you need to bring that down to maybe 7 categories because people can pretty much only keep 7 different concepts in their head when they're browsing. A great way to do that is to write all of the different topics on cards. I'll give all 300 of them to a customer or a user of your product and say, put them into piles that are similar. And after they've put them into those piles, you can ask them, what would you call that grouping? So if you had to put a label on that, what would you call that? And if you actually go out to a set of users, you'll find patterns in terms of how they group what happens in the world. It's very simple when you work inside of a company to categorize things based on your own internal work environment. So the things that, Yurka works on, you put in one bucket, and the things that Jim works on, you put in another bucket, because you associate them with the people that design them, the part of the business that they're in, what maybe their level, all kinds of things like that. So people who design often have design biases, which are from their own environment. So you need to get these things in front of users. And also, as I mentioned, paper prototyping, you can actually, with users, put something in front of them and say, which button would you click on? And they say the button's not there. Give them a piece of paper. Say, design the button. Write the label on it. Cut it out. Let's paste it on. Now, that doesn't mean that you give up your skills as a designer or an engineer. You don't have to do exactly what the user tells you, but you can use that input as cues to how to do a better job. So we've talked about general psychology of users and kind of a general user base. The reality is users have all kinds of physical differences in terms of their abilities. So we also have to worry about what's called accessibility. And so there's either accessible design, other people call it universal design, where we design for what we call equitable use. So people have differences in terms of vision, physical ability, motor skills. You want to make sure that everyone is able to use your product. It needs to be flexible, simple, and intuitive to use. The information needs to be perceptible. So I'm a little bit nearsighted. I'm not wearing my glasses today. Luckily, these words are big enough, but if they were the typical size on a screen, I'd have problems reading them. So you need to make sure that people can perceive the information or adjust an interface in order to be able to perceive it. You also have to build in tolerance for error. People have a certain amount of inability to pick small objects near each other. You need to understand those tolerances and make sure you build in for them. Also, worry about low physical effort. Some people don't have the same level of strength as a lot of you buff and strong-looking men in the room. And you need to create size and space that allow people to access something. So just for an example, I went out. There are lots of tools online that will help you do this. But I'm looking at just one small aspect of perception, and that's color perception. We all know what Google looks like. So I went online, and I took the Google logo, and the normal one is here at the top. I also looked at for the typical deuteranope who has red-green color blindness, also protanope, which is red-green color blindness, and also someone who would have tridanope vision, which is green-yellow deficiency. So you can see the kind of variation in the way the logo looks. Well, what does that mean in terms of an actual design? Here's Lufthansa. This is the flight that I came on last night, and here's their website. And you can see up here, Lufthansa's main color is kind of yellow-orange. A deuteranope will see that as green, and a tridanope will see this as almost pink. So if you're depending on color as a cue, in order for people to decide what button to pick or what to prioritize, you have to realize people see color very differently. In this case, it's probably mostly an impact on Lufthansa's brand. They've done a good job in terms of making sure the labels and the hierarchy are clear without total dependence on color. But I think many of us naturally assume yellow in most cultures means caution, means poison in Asian countries. Red is often an alert color. So we think, oh, you make something red, people know that's the panic button. Well, not everybody sees red. And if they do see red, they may not see it as red. So if you're going to design for your users to design a great product, if you're going to make sure that your product is usable by everyone, there's another aspect to usability that I really want to leave you with today to think about. Because ultimately, we talked about the iPod earlier, or Google earlier. One of the things that you can do with user-centered design is actually invent great new products that haven't even been designed yet. So if you take this usability process beyond just understanding your users to build the product you've already defined, but actually go out and look at users in their environment, you may discover products or services that they need that you weren't even aware of. So ultimately, an intimate understanding of users can allow you to build new markets and new opportunities. Here are some companies that have done that. RSS feeds, that takes the web or the internet to a completely new level. Flickr for images. It's not something that people even thought was necessary. Or another great example, Starbucks. You guys have great coffee houses here in Prague. I've already been to one. And across Europe. In the United States, not so much. How many of you visited the US? How many of you had coffee there? Was it a great experience? So Starbucks recognized that there was an opportunity there to help people have a better experience while they were having a cup of coffee. So these are companies, also BMW with the Mini, who looked at the environment, they understood their users, and they saw an opportunity to build new business. So ultimately, usability engineers are people who are both engineers and people who understand users and bring users into their design process. And sometimes usability engineers, I think a lot of you are product engineers. How many of you think of the person who actually, you may not want to raise your hand on this, who designed the interface screens as kind of junior engineers? Anybody willing to admit it? Okay. Our polls will tell us, although users may lie, that in engineering organizations, often the people that design the interfaces are considered to be kind of low-end engineers because they're not designing the features. The reality is they're the people that will make or break your product. So it's important for usability engineers and for usability in general that usability engineers go beyond just engineering, but they understand their customers and they understand their business. Because in order to become a leader, you need to be able to talk to the business people in your company and show them how changing a product can build new business and actually make your company more money. So this is from the AIGA, which is the American Institute of Graphic Design in the US, but it's a little bit of an inspirational concept. Ultimately, the future is being built by designers. And great designers who understand the user are the people that are going to build those best designs. So ultimately, what I want to leave you with today is that taking advantage of usability, studying a little bit of anthropology, psychology, human-computer interface, or human factors, and adding that into the work that you do can help you become a leader in the companies that you work in. So how do you get there? One important thing is to note the difference between being a resource and a leader. So it's not enough to just implement screens for the products that are being designed or implement the buttons or the various interfaces for the physical products. You really need to be a leader. You need to go out and understand the users who are going to use the products that you design and come back to the business and show how the product can be better and ultimately benefit the business. You need to develop some skills. Ethnography, you really need to understand people, anthropology, the various disciplines of HCI. That doesn't mean that you need to go back to school and get a new degree, but you could go out, maybe take a class, or just start doing it. Go out and observe people. And ultimately, you have to get out of your comfort zone. You have to understand the businesses that you work in and the environments that you work in, and also the environments in which your products are sold, and become a leader in your business. So the next time you see a sign like this, you can remember that there's not just one way to get ahead, and that obviously this was not designed by a usability engineer. And the next time that you see a sign like this, you probably could go in and offer them your skills as a usability engineer to do a better job. So with that, I want to say thank you and see if anybody has any questions. Yes?
That's rather a comment. Well, I see certain danger in becoming a leader, because then you could even feel like a social hero, or even commit social engineering, and that has proven bad. So the distance between So to keep an honest leader, but even with this all honesty, doing social engineering, knowing more that I know more than my users is very, very dangerous. You might probably have heard of the Sun Louis trouble and so on. So they are dangerous, and sorry, this country has been manipulated too.
Thank you for that comment, and it's an important one. And by leader, I don't mean becoming a leader of people, and I also don't mean assuming that you know more than your users. The ideal sense of being a leader as a usability engineer is actually going out and testing a product with lots of users and coming back with data to your team to show we tested this with 100 people and 80 people had a problem with this section, we should change that. And in that sense, you become a representative of those people, and really what you're doing is bringing the people into the process of design. So to be a leader doesn't necessarily mean to dictate how people are going to work, but it means to not passively just, if an engineer says, design the screen this way, put the button here, do this, do that, to just do it. You also need to take your own responsibility to go out and test that and see if it works and bring information back to your team. Because someone who's designing the interface is essentially the interface between the engineering and the public or the buyer of the product. So that's the kind of leadership that I mean, which is to bring that knowledge back to your company, because if you don't, probably no one else will.
Yes, thank you. I agree.
Sure. Anybody else? Yes.
So first, let me say it was a very good presentation. I really like that. And second, now can you say some examples from your own products where usability really helped and it was first unrealized until you actually try it out and you see the results?
Sure. I can give you a great example. I worked on a recent redesign of Sun.com, which is Sun's web interface. And we have, I think, just in software alone, we have over 330 products, which is a lot. And we found that people would come to look for a product, potentially. They would come to the product page, and there'd be a big drop-off rate. So if you look through the logs, you'd see people clicked a lot of times and eventually left and never actually got to a product page. So we went out and we did some testing, and we figured out exactly the example that I gave you. The products were organized by the business units that built them. So there was the Java group and the Solaris group, and we just basically put everything in the buckets of the people that built them. The reality is people that don't work at Sun, they don't know how the company is structured. So what we did was we actually went out and we 330 cards and we gave them to people and asked them to sort them. And we went to different places. So we did some testing in the US, in Europe, and in Asia. And we had people actually categorize the cards, and they categorized them completely differently than we did at Sun, and actually in very similar ways. So they put tools together. It didn't matter whether they were Solaris tools or Java tools. They put web stuff together. It didn't matter whether it was in the Java group or in the directory services group. And they organized them all and put labels on them. So we went back and redesigned that page and put those 330 products into a different set of categories with labels that we got from people outside of the company. And in fact, the day the site went live, we had about an 80% improvement rate in terms of people not dropping off and actually getting to product leaf nodes. So that's an example of the kind of work that we've done. And it's usually at those points in time where you just assume that you know the answer and don't check, that you're most likely to make a mistake. It seemed very easy at the time to categorize those products, but the reality was the categories were completely opaque to the user.
How difficult it is to change the paradigm in the company to actually rely on usability as one of the instruments for improving it?
Great question, because that's one of the toughest things. And that's when I was mentioning the idea of leadership. When we first brought this data back into the company, people within the company, they like to have their products all in one section. So they only have to go to one place to look at their products. So it was very challenging to people initially when we brought this data back. And the thing about it is, in my experience at least, the more actual data that you have, not opinion, because if you come in and you say, I want to move this from here to here, people will say, why? And if you say, because I think it's better, because I'm an expert, because I know more, they probably will disagree with you. But if you can bring in information that is direct data from direct users and say, this is not my idea, this is what I'm hearing from users, and ultimately they buy our products and pay our salaries, it is much easier to get those things changed. But I think the most important thing is to collect real data and to be honest with yourself, because sometimes the data will be different or conflict with what you think is the right thing to do. And you need to be, humble enough to accept the data for what it is and not try to manipulate it. Sure. Yes.
May I have one question? Maybe I would be a devil's advocate right now.
Great.
I have read a very interesting article which was named End of Usability Culture. And it described a situation where there are maybe 5 competitors in bank sector maybe, and they all hire usability experts. And although they spend billions of dollars to distinguish their brands and to tell their users that they are different than others, that the result of hiring usability experts was that their websites were all almost the same, because they followed usability recommendations and so on, and the result was that their website wasn't distinguishable at all.
Well, I'll be a devil's advocate with you. Is that necessarily a bad thing? I mentioned that Control-C for copy, Control-V for paste. That's true if you buy a product from Microsoft or Star Office from Sun or from Macromedia or Adobe or anybody else. How would you feel as a user if you went into a product and you did Control-C and something completely different happened? Would that be frustrating? Yes. So in reality, this is something that you find in the design industry. We find design patterns that become universal patterns. It's dangerous sometimes to assume that something's a universal pattern. You really need to do testing. But ultimately, once people understand a task model, a way to accomplish a task, they acquire that knowledge. There's 2 things that go on when people approach a new piece of technology. There's an effort to learn. They need to spend some time learning how to use it. And then ultimately there's an effort to use, which approaches some kind of asymptotic mean of it's always about that hard to use once you know how to use it. Well, after you've acquired the learning, if you can apply the same learning pattern to another environment, the effort to learn curve becomes lower and gets closer and closer to that asymptotic mean. So you don't ever have to learn again how to copy something because you know how. And that's very useful from a user's perspective. So to the extent that there are design patterns that can be copied from place to place, I think that that's a good thing. Now, what might be a bad thing is paying usability engineers tons of money to tell you what is immediately observable. So that's also part of learning these skills yourself, because ultimately when you go out and hire a usability engineering consultancy, they may very well tell you something that they already know to be true, but they charge you full price to tell you. So I think anyone in this room certainly has the skills in the background to do some basic observation and see, well, if 10 out of 10 companies do this the same way, I'm probably fine to do it the same way and invest the engineering in a new feature. So the usability engineers probably weren't saying the way to distinguish yourself is to offer additional services, not by making the way to do an online payment different. Why not allow them to do online payments and some other service? So often the way to distinguish a product isn't by making them learn a new way to do the same thing, but by giving them a new service, a new feature, and actually enhancing the product. And often good usability design, especially if the engineers can actually do it themselves rather than bringing somebody in, you can determine, where do I invest my energy? Is it in distinguishing something that's a commodity and trying to make it different? And is that even worthwhile? Or do I add a new feature so that there's a reason for a margin in the value of my product?
May I have a follow-up question on this?
Sure.
How plugs the aesthetic value of something into this kind of usability paradigm? It's a follow-up question to this issue. You mentioned iPod.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great product which functions very well, very easy to use. but it at the same time has a very distinctive aesthetic value to it. People recognize the white cables
Sure.
from the headphones, the shape of the device, and I'm not sure if aesthetics is something which is directed only by functionality. It's a value in itself. It sells.
I completely agree with you. I actually, at Sun, I manage global brand and advertising. And so I believe very much in the aesthetics of design. And that's a complete, be great to do a presentation on that topic as well. One thing that I can guarantee you, designers will not teach you how to make breakthrough, new, or beautiful design. What they will help you do is make sure that the thing that you design is easy to use, straightforward, and intuitive. But if you want to take things to a new place, so if one of those banks wanted to create a completely different experience for banking, don't go to a usability engineer. Because the reality is, if you put something completely radically different in front of a user that they've never seen before, they will usually reject it because it's unfamiliar. And that's where, when we talk about the aesthetics of design, you need to have the confidence and the bravery to put something out into the marketplace. A good example in here was the Aeron chair. When the Aeron chair was initially designed, there's a great book out now by Malcolm Gladwell called Blink, where he talks about when to use user testing and when not to use user testing. They took the chair out and they showed it to people and said, would you buy this? And to a person, every single person said no, because it looked so strange. So what they had done in that situation is they'd done all of the user testing to understand what users really need, which is comfort, heat dissipation, all of those things. They recognized that they were in the product, but the aesthetics of the product, the look of the product, would be challenging. And they were able to make the decision that it serves the actual user needs because we've tested and determined the needs, but we will take a leap of faith on the aesthetics of the design, and it became the #1 best-selling office chair of all time and the biggest chair ever sold by Herman Miller. So aesthetics is a different topic, and it's really important. I think in here I may have quoted Don Norman, who for years, as a usability engineer, spoke out against aesthetics, and he's actually recanted. He has a great essay and a book out called Beautiful Things Work Better, where he's basically actually gone out and showed through testing that where one object, the two things do exactly the same thing, and one is physically or aesthetically attractive and the other isn't, people will believe that the more aesthetically attractive one works better, even if it doesn't. But those kind of effects are observable and testable, but I'm all for aesthetics. Anybody else?
Choosing the testing groups of the people. I mean, your testing groups are just users of your product or just users of computer? Because I mean, if you will use just users of your product, they are used to the product somehow, so they will use it somehow. And if you will choose just users of computer, maybe you will find new market or you will open your product for more people.
Great question, and I think you answered it as you asked it. That's part of understanding business and what the business strategy of your company is. If what you're worried about is selling more into your existing user base, so selling more products to the people who already use it, then you're probably going to choose users from that direct user base because people hate change. It's just natural. So if you go to your existing user base, even if something's very hard to use, they aren't going to want you to change it. But if your business strategy is to open up to new markets, to actually extend that product to other markets, then you would select a completely different group. So you need to think about, what is the goal of the design and what's the strategy of the business that you work for. I recommend, regardless, that it's a good idea, even if your goal is to go to your existing user base and sell more product, it's always good to have a few people to test with who've never used your product before. Because what you'll discover with them are the learned behaviors that are completely nonsensical. How many of you, do your parents use computers at home? So my mom is, I think, 75, And she'd never used a computer before. She's like, you know, you work in the computer industry. I feel like I should really understand computers. I should understand what you do. And I said, great. So I went out and I bought her a beautiful laptop, got her DSL service at home. And I sat down with her and I was, you know, showing her how to use it. And the first thing, so we did this whole session and it was kind of confusing, first time using a mouse. And we went to shut down the computer and I was showing her how to shut down the computer. And this happened to be a Windows computer, even though I work for Sun. And the first thing she said is, why do I push the start button to stop the computer? Right? It's such an obvious question. And I said, well, it's just obvious. You know, you always go to the start button because that's how you do everything. And she said, well, but I'm not starting anything. I'm stopping. Why do I have to press the start button? Right? I mean, that's just brain dead obvious. So sometimes it's good to go to people, even people who don't use computers, and have them have an opportunity. Because if you look at user interfaces over time, there are the conventions like copy and paste, which I think have added to people's ease of use. There are a lot of other conventions that we've just learned and we put up with. And if we're ever going to take computers to the next level, to make them universally accessible and usable, we need to go back and rethink some of those very basic things, like starting something to stop it. Anybody else?
One question from our side. Did you found in your research or in your experiences some differences between well-designed site or well-designed application in comparison with nationality? For example, Asian or US, if there are some differences in well-designed, or when I found some best design for myself, it worked in every world, or if it's different, do you find some differences in your research?
There are definitely some differences, and some more obvious than others, because there are big cultural differences, not just in terms of cultural expectations, but even really direct things, like the direction that people read, from right to left or left to right, or up and down, as opposed to right to left. Also, currency. How people think spatially is very different. So there are some things that seem to work very well universally. There's some, we have what they call the reptilian brain, the part of your brain that is sort of pre-thinking. And the responses that happen there are pretty universal. One of the reasons why when you, the way exit doors are designed in buildings, you push them to get out. When people are frightened, if there's a fire, and this is the same everywhere in the world, they will push to get out. And even if there's a big sign that says pull, and a button and everything, and a big handle, people will push against the door until they burn and die, often. Because there's a certain amount of the kind of basic things that are the same everywhere. And then, so certain kinds of design principles are pretty universal, but there are a lot of really important cultural differences. And so, understanding cultural anthropology and ethnography is very useful in design, and if you don't understand it, that's where testing becomes really important. And so, yeah, there are some basic and very interesting differences in especially Asian design, and design paradigms that work in Asia are very different from both European and at least North American design principles. Anybody else? Okay, well, I want to thank you all for your time, and it sounds like you've got a great afternoon planned, so I'll turn it back over to you, Joe.